Picture this, November 1917. A French soldier crouches in a trench, fingers trembling as he opens a letter from home. His wife writes about their daughter's first steps. He smiles. Then the whistle blows. 60 seconds later, a greenish-yellow cloud rolls over the trench wall like something from hell itself. The letter falls into the mud. The soldier claws at his throat. His lungs are dissolving from the inside out. This was the real horror of World War I, not the version you learned in school. What you're about to hear goes far beyond the history books. Between 1914 and 1918, over 17 million people died in what they called the war to end all wars. But the numbers don't tell you what it was actually like. The smell of rotting flesh that never left the trenches. The sounds men made when poison ate through their lungs. The things soldiers saw that broke their minds forever. April 22, 1915. Ypres, Belgium. French colonial troops noticed something strange drifting toward them across no man's land. At first, they thought it was morning fog. It wasn't fog. A German engineer named Fritz Haber had convinced his military that chemistry could win the war. That morning, German troops opened the valves on 5,730 cylinders containing 168 tons of chlorine gas. The cloud moved at walking speed. 6 feet tall, yellow-green, beautiful in a horrifying way. When it reached the French lines, men started screaming. Chlorine gas reacts with the moisture in your lungs to form hydrochloric acid. Your body drowns itself trying to protect you. Soldiers coughed up chunks of their own lung tissue. Some men's lips turned black. Others went blind. 5,000 soldiers were killed in 10 minutes. Another 15,000 were injured, many permanently disabled. But here's what they don't tell you. Fritz Haber's own wife, Clara, was also a chemist. When she found out what her husband had created, she took his service pistol and shot herself in the heart. Haber found her dying in their garden. He left for the Eastern Front the next morning to supervise more gas attacks. The horror had only just begun. By the end of the war, both sides were using gas weapons. Chlorine, phosgene, and the worst of all, mustard gas. Unlike chlorine, mustard gas didn't kill you immediately. It was almost odorless. Soldiers didn't even know they'd been exposed until hours later. First, their eyes started burning. Then enormous blisters erupted across their skin, some the size of a human hand. The blisters formed inside their lungs too. Men spent weeks drowning in their own fluids, unable to see, their skin falling off in sheets. Over 1.3 million soldiers were casualties of chemical weapons. Many didn't die until years later, their lungs permanently destroyed, coughing blood until the day they finally suffocated. And Fritz Haber? He won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. During his acceptance speech, he never mentioned the weapon he'd created. August 12, 1915. Gallipoli Peninsula, Turkey. The British were losing badly, but nothing prepared anyone for what happened to the 1st 5th Norfolk Regiment that day. According to official records, the battalion attacked Hill 60 and suffered heavy casualties. Simple, tragic, end of story. Except that's not what witnesses reported. 3 New Zealand soldiers filed a sworn statement after the war. They claimed they watched the Norfolk Regiment march up a sunken road toward Hill 60. A strange, solid-looking cloud hung over the hill despite clear weather everywhere else. The cloud sat perfectly still even though a breeze was blowing. They watched as the entire battalion, between 800 and 1,000 men, marched straight into this cloud. Not a single soldier came out the other side. After about an hour, the cloud lifted straight up into the air and drifted away against the wind. When British forces finally captured the area months later, they found no trace of the battalion. No bodies, no equipment, nothing. The New Zealand witnesses stuck to their story for the rest of their lives, even when accused of lying or suffering from shell shock. So what really happened? In 1965, 50 years after the battle, the Turkish government returned the bodies of 180 soldiers they'd found buried in a mass grave near Hill 60. British investigators confirmed these were men from the Norfolk Regiment. They'd been captured, executed, and buried. Mystery solved, right? Not quite. The grave contained less than a quarter of the battalion. Where were the other 600 men? And why did 3 trained military observers report seeing something that couldn't possibly have happened? Some historians suggest the cloud was smoke from artillery fire combined with heat distortion. Others point out the witnesses may have watched the Norfolks march into a ravine where they were ambushed. But here's the disturbing part. Similar reports exist from other battles. Soldiers on both sides reported strange cloud formations that seemed to move with purpose. Mist that appeared on clear days and swallowed entire units. The British military classified the full reports from Gallipoli for decades. What else did those documents contain? July 1, 1916. The Battle of the Somme. The single bloodiest day in British military history. British commanders believed they'd solved trench warfare. For 7 days, they bombarded German positions with 1.7 million artillery shells. The plan was simple. The shelling would destroy the German defenses, and British troops would walk across no man's land and occupy the empty trenches. At 7:30 a.m., officers blew their whistles. 100,000 British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began walking toward German lines. The German defenses weren't destroyed. The soldiers had been hiding in deep underground bunkers, some 40 feet below ground. When the shelling stopped, they rushed to their machine gun positions. What happened next was industrial-scale slaughter. British troops had been ordered to walk, not run, in neat lines. They were told the advance would be unopposed. German machine gunners opened fire. Each gun could shoot 600 rounds per minute. The British soldiers, weighed down with 60 pounds of equipment, couldn't run. They walked straight into interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Within the first 30 minutes, casualty rates in some units reached 90%. By sunset on July 1, 1916, 19,240 British soldiers were dead. Another 35,000 were wounded. For some battalions, casualty rates reached 100%. Every single man was either killed or wounded. One officer later described no man's land. The ground was carpeted with bodies. You could walk from the British trenches to the German lines without ever touching the earth. The battle continued for another 4.5 months. When it finally ended in November, over 1 million men from all sides were casualties. The British had advanced a maximum of 7 miles. 7 miles. 1 million casualties. In some sections, the concentration of corpses was so high that when shells exploded, they'd blast decades-old remains into the air mixed with fresh casualties. Soldiers reported body parts raining down during bombardments. To this day, French farmers find human remains when they plow fields near the Somme. Bones still rise to the surface every spring like some horrible crop that never stops growing. August 1914. Mons, Belgium. The British Expeditionary Force was in retreat, vastly outnumbered by advancing German troops. The soldiers were exhausted, running on no sleep, low on ammunition. They should have been wiped out. But they weren't. Within days, stories began circulating among British troops. Soldiers swore they'd seen angelic figures on the battlefield protecting them. Some claimed ghostly archers, like those from the medieval Battle of Agincourt, had appeared and fired arrows at German positions. Others reported seeing St. George himself riding among the British lines. The stories spread like wildfire. The Angel of Mons became one of the most famous wartime legends in history. There was just one problem. A Welsh author named Arthur Machen had published a short story called The Bowman in the London Evening News on September 29, 1914. In his fictional story, he described phantom archers from Agincourt appearing to help British soldiers at Mons. The story was clearly labeled as fiction, but desperate people needed hope. Within weeks, readers started claiming the story was true. When Machen publicly stated he'd invented the entire thing, people accused him of covering up the truth. Some believed the British government had pressured him to recant. The legend grew. Soldiers who'd been at Mons swore they'd seen something unusual, even if they couldn't explain what. Were they experiencing hallucinations from exhaustion? Mass hysteria? We'll never know for certain. But the Angel of Mons gave hope to millions of people who desperately needed to believe someone, or something, was watching over their sons and husbands in that mechanized hell. called it shell shock at first. Soldiers who'd break down crying. Men who couldn't stop shaking. Troops who'd stare at nothing for hours, unable to speak or respond to commands. Military commanders didn't understand it. Many believed these men were cowards faking illness to escape combat. Hundreds were court-martialed for cowardice. Some were executed by firing squad, shot by their own side for the crime of having their minds broken by horror. But doctors had started noticing something. The symptoms were real, physical, measurable. Men who'd never shown fear in combat would suddenly be unable to function. Their hands would shake uncontrollably. They'd wake up screaming from nightmares so vivid they couldn't distinguish them from reality. One doctor, Charles Myers, published a paper in 1915 describing what he called shell shock. Later, he and others realized the truth was more complex. This was psychological trauma on a scale humanity had never before created. These men had watched their friends torn apart by shells. They'd lived in trenches filled with corpses and rats. They'd gone days without sleep while artillery pounded their positions. They charged into machine gun fire and somehow survived when everyone around them died. Human minds weren't designed for industrialized warfare. By the end of the war, over 80,000 British soldiers were treated for shell shock. Tens of thousands more never received treatment. They went home carrying invisible wounds that would torment them for the rest of their lives. Many couldn't hold jobs. Sudden noises would send them diving for cover. They'd wake up swinging at their wives, trapped in flashbacks where they were still in the trenches. Some eventually took their own lives, unable to escape memories of what they'd experienced. Today we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. We understand it better. But the ghosts those men carried home from the trenches are still haunting their descendants today. November 11, 1918, 11 a.m. The armistice took effect. After 4 years, 3 months, and 1 week, the guns finally fell silent. Over 17 million people were dead. Another 23 million were wounded. Entire generations of young men had been wiped out. France had lost 1.4 million soldiers, nearly 4% of its entire population. Germany lost over 2 million. Britain lost close to 1 million. But the dying wasn't over. The war had created perfect conditions for disease. Millions of men living in close quarters, moving between countries, their immune systems weakened by stress and malnutrition. When the Spanish flu pandemic hit in 1918, it spread through military camps like wildfire. The flu killed more people than the war itself. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 50 million worldwide. Some researchers believe it may have been as high as 100 million. Soldiers who'd survived 4 years of shells and gas and machine guns came home and died coughing blood in their own beds. The war killed them anyway, just more slowly. And here's the final, crushing irony. Many of the men making decisions throughout the war were old enough that they remembered when warfare was different. Cavalry charges, swords, battles where you could see your enemy's face. They kept trying to apply those old tactics to new weapons. Machine guns, artillery that could hit targets 12 miles away, poison gas, aircraft, tanks. Humanity had invented ways to kill on an industrial scale, but the men in charge still thought in terms of honor and glory. The result was 4 years of young men being fed into a meat grinder by old men who couldn't or wouldn't understand that warfare had changed forever. They called it the war to end all wars. 21 years later, it started again, even worse than before. The Western Front is quiet now. Peaceful farmland where once millions of men died in the mud. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces. Shells still surface in fields. Unexploded ordnance still kills farmers a century later. The generation that fought World War I is gone now. The last veteran died in 2012 at age 110. But the lessons remain if we choose to learn them. War isn't glory. It isn't adventure. It's poison clouds melting lungs. It's men vanishing into mist. It's bodies stacked like cordwood in fields that should be growing wheat. It's minds breaking under pressures they were never meant to endure. The real horror of World War I isn't the ghost stories or the legends. It's that everything I've told you actually happened. Every word is documented. Every death was real. And humanity looked at this horror and decided to do it all again, only bigger, less than a generation later. That's the darkest fact of all.